This video will show you in great detail how to make perfect wrapped wire loops for jewelry making. I guarantee you've never seen a tutorial like this one, but if you follow the steps I demonstrate and you practice them a bit, you'll be able to form wire wrapped loops that look professional. Hi, Jen Hanscom here from Jewelry Classes with Jen, your practical guide for making stylish silver jewelry right from home. I have a unique approach for working with wire to make jewelry. As an artist, I'm attracted to patterns created from consistent repetitive forms. So I was driven to figure out how to form shapes repeatedly and achieve the same result over and over again. As a jewelry instructor, I've dissected my methods and I break them down to convey them to you in easy to follow step-by-step tutorials. I take the time to explain which tool to use and where to grasp, where and how the pressure should be applied, and how to get professional looking results with consistency. So please, watch this in-depth tutorial on how to make perfect wrapped wire loops on bead links. See for yourself how unique my approach is and how comprehensive my lessons are. You can also get a copy of the written instructions for free. They feature step-by-step photos you can follow as you practice. Just click on the link in the description below to head over to the free tutorial on the Jewelry Classes with Jen website. Fill in your name and the email at the prompt, and within moments you'll get an email with the document in both right-hand and left-hand versions. That's right, if you're left-hand dominant, every action would be mirrored. So the left-hand version of the instructions features photos specific for you to follow. If you like this video, consider joining the Jewelry Classes with Jen Online Learning Center, because there are 4 more fundamental lessons in the Wire Wrapped Loop series. There's a video about how to connect wire wrapped bead links loop to loop in a series. There's another lesson about how to wrap loops with head pins for bead dangles. Oh, and by the way, you might want to check out the video I have here on YouTube about how to melt your own head pins with sterling silver wire. The third video in the series is how to make large loop wire wrapped beads, which includes tips on working with irregular shaped beads like these turquoise nuggets. And then the fourth one is how to make coiled wire teardrops to feature side drilled beads. Plus, there's an additional 25 fundamental lessons for making jewelry, including a masterful approach for making simple loops. They're so much easier with this system. The Online Learning Center also offers more than 30 stylish jewelry projects, and the library of lessons and tutorials just keeps growing, all for less than the cost of a typical jewelry making class. So without any further ado, here's the primary wire wrapped bead link tutorial in its entirety. In the world of making jewelry, well, handmade jewelry that is, the art of wire wrapping a bead is very prevalent. Most jewelers that I know, though, or jewelry makers that I know, don't feel confident that they are able to achieve perfect wire loops. So that is what this video is all about. The perfect wire loop is a little bit elusive. Let me just explain what we're going for. One is that it has very equal, tight coil on either side of the bead. There's the same distance on either side. The loops themselves are perfectly round and centered to those coils and the bead. And then on the back side is you have the end of the wire wrap ending on the same side. So let's dig in and I will show you how my approach to wire wrapping is very different from the majority of what you will learn out there in the world of do-it-yourself jewelry making. So I'm going to demonstrate using this sodalite bead. It's a 6mm round bead, and the hole that's drilled in this bead is large enough for 20 gauge wire, which incidentally 20 gauge wire is probably the largest gauge wire I typically use for wire wrapping. A lot of the beads that you might find that you want to wire wrap have a smaller hole, and so the 20 gauge wire wouldn't fit in them anyway. But I will say that you want to select a wire that is fairly taut in the hole of the bead. You can also do a series of beads, but I would not recommend doing them too long because the wire that they're structured on wouldn't be very strong, because it has to be a pretty fine gauge. So let's dig in. I've got some 20 gauge silver wire here, and I am going to just kind of straighten that off the coil a bit here. I'm not worried about the end of the wire being flush cut because I am going to be trimming both ends of this wire. You can see with my ruler here that a 6mm bead is, let's say, roughly 1/4 inch. And I want to allow 1.5 inches of wire to make a pigtail wire wrap. And so I want one of those on each end. So that means I need 3 inches for wire wrapping plus 1/4 inch for the bead. I'm just going to round it up, and I'm going to cut a 3.5 inch length. So I'm going to go ahead and place the end of the wire at 3.5. I'll mark at the 0 point with a fine tip Sharpie marker, ultra fine tip actually. And then I will go ahead and just, cut my wire to length. I've got my runaway bead there. Alrighty. So set that bead aside for now. And so what I'm going to do is, before I have the bead on there, I'm going to start with the first wire wrap. And so, like I said, I wanted to have 1.5 inches of wire to create the wire wrap. And so I'm going to just mark at 1.5 inches. That's not going to accommodate for my little coil, so I could actually go just a slight bit shorter than that, but that's just a good rule of thumb, 1.5 inches down on the wire. So now I'm going to, let me work on that focus here for you. Okay. So now I want to bend the wire at the mark. So I'm placing the mark just to the left of my plier, and I'm going to bend that wire towards me. Right angle bend. Notice that I used my thumb as an opposing pressure, and I used my index finger to bend the wire, isolating my pressure so that I only have that one place of pressure, getting a nice sharp right angle bend right at the mark. Okay, now most jewelers use a round nose plier, the double cone style. I am not a fan. I find that if I squeeze too hard, I get tool marks lickety split, and also too, the loops can come out as varying sizes. So although I will use this if I need to for a really small loop, I don't use it if I don't have to. What I use instead is this stepped plier. It's like a chain nose plier on one side where it's got the flat surface and then the 3 steps. The only supplier I have found that has this particular style is Beadsmith. But I did find that the steps are not always exactly the same size, one plier to another, even though they're from the same supplier. So just something to be aware of. Okay, so I have my wire. This here is the 2-inch segment this one here is the 1.5 inch segment. Again, I'm using that 1.5 inch length in order to make the loop. So I'm going to place my stepped plier so that the flat side is just under there. Let me work on that focus for you a little bit. Okay. I want to be looking down the jaw of the plier. That wire is situated in there so that I'm working on a perpendicular plane. It's perpendicular this way and it's perpendicular this way. But what I want you to be looking at is looking down the jaw of the plier. And so that requires you to cock your wrist a little bit in order to be able to see that view. Now I'm going to have my index finger on the opposing side of the plier, and I'm going to use the side of my thumb to bring this wire that's facing down at 6 o'clock, that's the 2 inch length that's facing down at 6 o'clock. And what I want to do is I want to ease that wire up so that it comes over to 9 o'clock. And what's going to happen is this little area here is going to curve along the curved side of the tool. You ready? You can see that the flex is happening right close to the tool, and we're going up to that 9 o'clock position. So now this wire is on a parallel plane to the other segment, and we have just started to create the loop. What I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate the tool so that the curve of the tool is really sitting in that seat of that little round area that we just created. And then I'm going to rotate my holding wrist so that I can reach around, and I'm going to, with my finger nice and close to the tool, I'm going to form that right around that step. And I'm going to rotate a little bit the tool, the flat side of the tool. I'm rotating the flat side of the tool out of the way so that I can cross over this stem, which is where the bead is going to sit. So in order to cross over, I'm going to cross over the top, and notice that my pressure is not further up the wire. I want my pressure to be as close to the tool as possible so that I get a perfectly round shape around the step of that tool. And then I want this tail to be 90 degrees from the stem that's going to go through the bead. So this is the wire that I'm going to coil with. This is the one that's going to have the coil on it, and then we're going to have the bead. So what I'm looking for with this placement as well is that the stem where the bead is going to go is centered to the round part of the tool so that it almost resembles a lollipop. You've got perfectly round shape. That's the exact size of that step of the tool, and then you've got your stem down here. So now I'm going to switch over to my chain nose plier because I want to sandwich this loop in order to coil. What I'm going to do is I'm going to flip it over so that the tail is headed away from me. Focus that a little bit better for you. The reason being is that when you open the or when you close the chain nose plier, whatever is closer to the join of the plier is actually going to be grasped a little bit tighter. And so because this wire right here is attached, or that section of the loop is what's attached to the wire that I'm going to coil with, I want to be sure that I'm grasping this part of the coil as best I can. So I'm grasping this way here. And so if I show you the view of the plier, I have a better grip on the fore side, or the side of the loop that's closer to me, than I do on the other side. So I've got this part of the loop is grasped tighter than the other side. And so that what that'll always mean is the wire is always going off of the tip of the plier. Now, with this wire at that perpendicular angle, I want to take that tail and I want to coil it around this stem wire that's going to go through the bead. And so what I do is I rest my thumb on that wire and I use my index finger really close to the plier in order to start getting that to rotate. And so you can see then I rest my finger and I use my thumb. As long as I keep that wire at a perpendicular angle, I will get a nice tight coil. There won't be any spaces as long as I keep that angle perpendicular. And so I want to go around 3 times on the front, and then I want it to end on the back. So the wire is going to end almost, it's not quite all the way so that it would be flat to where it started, but almost. You can see that I've got a nice tight coil and I've got that perfectly round shape. My round loop did not distort at all because I had a really strong grip on this edge over here, which is where the pressure was to create that coil. So now I can go in, I'm going to rotate that so that the end of the coil is now on the top. And I'm going to go in with my flush cutters and I'm going to just flush cut at that nice close angle there. Always have your thumb over the tail of the wire that you're cutting off so that it doesn't fly across the room. Now we want to file where we flush cut, just so that the little seam from where the flush cutter came together to cut the wire, there's just a little tiny gap. So let me zoom in a little bit here for you. Work on that focus. There we go. You can see that there's just a little seam from the flush cutter. And so with my hand supported on my work table, I'm going to use my barrette file or barrette file, and I'm going to just file that flat plane from the flush cutter. That just smoothed that out. As an aside, when you have a barrette or barrette file, you want to be sure that you sand or file the edges smooth so that when you run the file on your fingernail, you don't get any grit. It doesn't mar your fingernail at all. That will keep it from harming anything that it abuts when you're using it. So I'm going to just straighten that stem a little bit in order to, so we have the first loop. So now I'm going to feed the bead on. And I want to be looking at this so that I'm looking at the back side of my pigtail. I'm going to also just point out here, when this happens, whoops, if you get that little tiny space between your loop and your coil, you can place the step of the tool in the loop, and then you can just press just like that in order to compress that space. That'll take care of that for you. Oh, and the other thing that we want to do too is after you file, you want to take your chain nose pliers and just make sure that that end of that wire is tucked right down. Okay, so now we're ready to feed that bead on. And then we want to have a space for the coil on the other side of the bead that is equal to this one here. And so depending on the size of your chain nose pliers, that may be at the very tip, it may be down just a little bit. It all depends on what size your chain nose pliers are and what size wire that you're working with. So the way that I measure it though, I'm going to just zoom out a little bit so that you can see what I'm doing here. If I place my pliers over the coil on the first side so that they're covering just the coil, not pushing the bead out of the way, and then I look at the profile view to see how far down the plier I have to grasp in order to be covering the coil. And then, so I was covering that coil, I'm going to call that about 1/8 of an inch down the pliers. And so then I'm going to hold about 1/8 of an inch down the pliers on the other side of the bead to create the same amount of space from the loop to the bead on the other side of the bead. Notice that my loop is on the perpendicular plane. Make sure that that's sitting on that perpendicular plane, that the loop itself. And then I'm going to use my index finger to create that 90-degree bend on the other side of the pliers. Also notice that it's the back side of the loop that I have here. So on this side, the wire in the middle went up and it would have bent out the opposite way. So everything will happen the same on this end. Now while I'm holding the tail out to the right or towards 3 o'clock, and I've got the bead stem, although this time it's not just a plain wire, it actually has the bead and the coil on it. I'm abutting the left side of that step from the stepped plier, or the flat side of the stepped plier, into the 90-degree bend. And what I want to do is I'm going to rotate that stem wire that's got the bead on it. Again, so right now it's at 6 o'clock, and I want to rotate it up to 9 o'clock, curving the wire along the step right in that little area. And so I'm using like the whole flat part of my thumb to bend this wire. Notice that everything is on the perpendicular plane. Always want to make sure everything is on the perpendicular plane before you start to work. And then you're forming on that perpendicular plane as well. And so I'm pressing that whole bead and stem wire assembly over to 9 o'clock. If the wire gets a little flexed in that area that you're going to be coiling, you can like slide the bead down and use the bead to help position the wire to straighten things. And so again, I've got that curve started, and so I'm going to rotate the flat part of the tool so I'm gripping right in the curve so that I'll have a smooth transition on the loop from that area. And then now I'm going to rotate my hand that's holding the plier so that I can reach around with my other one, forming that wire nice and close to the step of the tool. Now I'm rotating the bead. I loosened my grip a little bit. I'm rotating the bead so that the flat side of the tool is out of the way. Grip it tight again, and then I'm going to take this wire and I'm just easing it past the bead, and then I'll make sure that it presses back down past the bead and get nice and flat on that same plane again. And then you want to try to get that pressed up there so that it's following the round step of the plier, and the tail is coming out 90 degrees from the stem wire. So we've got that stem wire is at 9 o'clock, and this tail that we're going to coil with is coming down to 6 o'clock. And here's where we're going to end up sandwiching that loop, so we're going to switch to the chain nose plier. When I switch to the chain nose plier though, remember I want to be holding the part of the loop that's connected to the tail that I'm going to coil with. So I'm going to rotate it so that the tail is away from me, and then I'm going to hold with my chain nose plier. Now notice when I grasp with my chain nose plier, I don't grasp straight across here because the wire needs to coil. So I've got that chain nose plier pivoted so that I can have the clearance for that wire to come and stay at that perpendicular plane. So again, same kind of a thing here. I'm resting on my index finger on the wire, and I'm going to support the stem wire with the bead as I take that and coil around. Now, if you need to pinch because maybe you have a large bead, let me see if I can get that a little bit closer. Then you can just make sure that you pull that wire taut and you really keep it at that on that perpendicular plane. And so you can see that my coil used up the full space because I had used the other side to measure it. And I want to end so that I started with the wire going away from me and I'm ending with the wire going away from me. I have 3 coils here on the front, and when I flip over to the back, you can see that all I've got to do now is trim that wire and back out a little bit so you can see that better. Sorry for the lighting change when I zoom in. I'm going to get in there as tight as I can with my flush cutter, holding that tail while I cut it off. And then I want to take my barrette file, but making sure that that edge has been sanded and buffed so that it's not going to harm the bead when I rub up against there. See if I can zoom in and show you the filing. But you can see that we've got just that little tail has just a little roughness from having the flush cut. And so you'll go in there with your barrette file, and because that edge of the file has been refined, it's not doing anything to harm the bead. Get that filed, and then you can take your chain nose pliers and you can crimp that wire down nice and taut. So this is what I would consider the back side of the loop. And so you've got the loop, the wire comes off of the loop, and then you have the end of the coil. And on the front side of the loop, you've got your perfect round loops, and you've got your 3 stripes of coil. Now, on the back side, from the edge of my chain nose plier, again, this is 20 gauge wire, so there's a little bit of pressure, but you can see there's just the tiniest little divot from the edge of the pliers. When I was holding the loop, it was from holding it like this. So there's two things. One is that if your pliers have been abused or have little nicks, you might sand up the edge, give it just a little softness here so that you're less likely to get that. If your pliers are in rough shape, you'll want to do that. And then the other thing is to just take out your little half round needle file, and you can just buff right across that little tool mark and then give it a little sand, and that will come out in a heartbeat. If you happen to have a flex shaft with or some kind of rotary tool that you can use polishing wheels on, a little pink Eve silicone polishing wheel will do the trick for that, no problem. And that's just a little quicker way in order to clean that up. But so that would yield your perfect pigtail wire loop. The thing is that by using this method, your pigtails, your loops always come out the same size because you're using the step of the step tool, and your measurements are all working out the same. I have to say that I recently just wire wrapped about 550 beads in order to create kits for a large group class, and 550 beads, and they all look the same. They all had perfectly round loops. They all have nice tight coils. Everything works out. So it may seem very awkward to do this when you first get started with it, especially if you've already been wire wrapping beads and perhaps used round nose pliers the whole time. Or some of my techniques where I isolate pressure are very different and unique for you. But I would challenge you to stick with it, because once you practice this and you get it down, you're going to be so thrilled to have such professional looking loops. So when you have these pigtail loops, they're permanently closed as well. So at this point you would have to use jump rings to make connections, or in another video I'll show you how you can connect the pigtail loops to something as a permanent connection. So before you do the coil, we connect the loops, and so I'll show you how I achieve that and still maintain these perfect shaped loops. I know this was a detailed video, but I still have so many more tips and tricks for making perfect wrapped wire loops. There are 4 more lessons in this series offered in the Learning Center. I cover how to connect wire wrapped beads loop to loop in a series, how to wrap a bead dangle using a head pin, how to vary the size of the loops, how to adapt to irregular shaped beads like nuggets, how to showcase a side drilled bead with a coiled teardrop, and how to keep a measurement log to save time and achieve a perfect space for your coils moving forward. The monthly cost of membership is less than a single jewelry making class. In fact, a whole year of membership is less expensive than many half-day workshops at a bead show. But it's worth so much more. Not only do you get access to the lessons, you can ask questions and get help along the way. Joining the Jewelry Classes with Jen online learning center just makes sense. You can find lots of tutorials online for free. Some of them are honestly pretty great, but it takes time to figure out which ones offer quality instruction. And when you're new to making jewelry, you may not realize when the advice you're following will make a piece of jewelry that won't be very durable. The practical advice you'll have access to in the Learning Center will save you lots of trial and error and give you the confidence that you're making jewelry you'll be proud to show off to your friends and family, or even to sell. Don't forget to click on the link below to get your free copy of the written instructions.